n-tier architecture or multi-layer architecture. How many of you are familiar with that concept? Okay. All right, so the idea of n-tier architecture is that you're going to take your application and not make it one monolithic program. You want to take your application and break it up into reusable parts. So things like Henry Ford, when he built the first automobile. He didn't build this one giant machine that was an automobile. He ended up building transmission system, engine, gears that go into that. He made reusable parts, he made components, and he made it so that he could use those parts over and over in different places. So the idea here is that you want to make your program modular and interchangeable. So we'll use this as an overly generic example, and I found a few different graphics. But the idea is that you have your presentation layer, or tier. So in your case, it's your Windows application. That's your presentation tier. And then underneath, you have what's called the logic tier or business tier, or layer. And that is where the brains of your program live. And then the third tier is your data tier. That's where your actual database lives, and maybe the components of communicating between your business layer and your data layer. Now, what's the value of doing this? Well, a real simple scenario could be, well, you wrote an application, a Windows application. As many of us know, most Windows applications are going away and being replaced by web applications. Well, the functionality of that application isn't changing. You're just changing the way it's presented. You're moving it off the desktop and into the cloud. So, the way that you're storing data is still perfectly valid. The way that you do the work that you do, the way that your program processes whatever the user input and things like that, for the most part, is probably still perfectly valid. The only thing that's changing is the presentation. It's going from being a Windows form to being a web page. So instead of reinventing all of this code over, why don't you just take these pieces and put them into a new project? So that's one example. Let me switch to a different graphic and I'll continue. Another diagram of the same idea. So again, presentation layer, business layer, data access layer, and then the database layer itself. So the database is where your actual data is stored. The data access layer is how your business layer, your business objects, your user, those types of components, your utility classes, get into the database. Now, maybe in a previous class, or maybe just the way that you would think through things is that if you needed to go out and get data from a database and show it on your screen, you would probably put all of that code inside of the button click. When I click this refresh button, it goes out to the database, it grabs the data it needs, and it loads it in a list box. Well, you've now taken your data access layer and plugged it directly into your presentation layer. Your form action causes data access. So if you end up going from a Windows form application to a web application, you now have to take all of that code and copy and paste it or replicate it on your web app. Instead, you bring that logic down to its own layer. And these layers, you can think of them as DLLs. So we talked about DLLs or class libraries. You take that code that does that work and you stick it in its own library. And then you reference those libraries. So that code that you would use to connect to a database, you would put it in its own class, you would take that class and you would put it in its own class library, its own DLL. So that when you change out your web or your WinForm for a web app, you just change out the top piece. But you keep using the same DLLs. Another example is what happens if maybe you're still writing a Windows application, your business logic is the same, your data access layer changes because you're now using a different database. You were using Microsoft SQL Server, and now, again, we talk about this idea of everything moving to the cloud. You move it up into an Azure Web Service or some other abstracted web database type system or NoSQL or anything of that sort, and that data source has now been completely changed. You don't want to have to go back and rewrite every screen of your application because that database change happened. Your screens should be related to your business layer. So let's use a concrete example for a moment. Let's say you're writing a program that allows students to schedule their course requests. Well, the screens are going to be the same. The business layer contains things like student, teacher, course, schedule. Those constructs are the same. The way that you take a student and you retrieve it from that NoSQL database, the query statement that you use, well, that probably changed because you went from a SQL-based system to a NoSQL-based system. But the mechanics that you use in your application shouldn't change. And we'll dig into this in more detail. But the idea is that this code stays the same, this code stays the same, or pretty close to the same. This one layer gets updated because your database changed. So you just take this piece out and you replace it with a new data access layer that knows how to talk NoSQL. So by building your application into these reusable parts, you can also say, well, my business layer and my data access layer are the same. So I have this application. My business and my data access layers are the same. I can now use these DLLs on my Windows application, my web application, my Windows Form application, and then if I'm writing apps using C# for iOS and Android, I can also use them for iOS and Android. So I'm now hitting 5 platforms without having to rewrite all of this code every time. The only piece that changes is my user interface. Because you're not going to use a Windows Form UI on a web app or a mobile app. You could, but it would probably look horrible. So you're now only changing out this one widget, this one gear, this one piece of your app. So as you start to think about how you build applications, and I'll be honest, when you start talking about building small applications that just kind of live by themselves, this architecture can be overkill. But if you're picturing building an application in an enterprise environment where things change, people change jobs, those job changes result in people making different decisions, those decisions result in purchases, those purchases result in this department over here went out and decided to buy a new piece of software that has a completely different back end than the one they were using before, but it interfaces with this piece of software that this department uses. And your job is to make it so that that Department B software works with Department A's new purchase. Or you're going to build a mobile app. Here's your mobile app that everyone's going out and downloading, and then here's the back end that's driving that application. Maybe one day you're hosting with Amazon. Well, Amazon got too expensive, so we bought our own servers. Well, you bought your own servers, you got to redirect all of that traffic. You have to rebuild all of that infrastructure potentially. You have all of this work that needs to be done, and you don't want to have to go out and modify every screen on your application to make it work with your new infrastructure. So something as simple as a mobile app really needs a lot of forethought into this architecture. You can't just, you could just wing it and kind of go with it and see what happens. But quickly, as things evolve, the architecture is actually a very good thing to lean on. Here's just another example of that. This is more ASP.NET focused, but it also applies to Windows Forms and everything else. So you have your presentation layer. You can also have the service layer. So if you have web services as kind of the middle layer for your disconnected apps, your business layer or business logic, your data layer, and then they call it the persistence layer, which is actually your storage. Where is it being stored? Okay? So that's all great in theory, but how do we actually make something that works? So I'm going to go ahead and start out by creating a new project. A Windows Form app. So this will be my application. Let me throw this together kind of how we had our app the other week. So we will have a list box and 3 buttons. So this will be add user. This will be remove user. This will be our exit button. Change the name, btn exit, btn remove, btn add. This will be LST users. Alright, and then we'll add our second form. Right click on my project, do add, new form. This will be my add user form. So I'll need 1, 2, 3, 4 text boxes. Oh, nice. That'll be my save button. Email and label. That'll be password. Give these good names real fast. TXT password, TXT email, TXT last name, TXT first name. Alright, so I have my form, my 2 forms. Now, last week I went ahead and I added a model right into this project. Well, instead what I want to do now is I want to create a new class library. I'm going to put my model class into a class library that I refer to as my mod4 core. So I'm going to right click on my solution, choose add, new project. So I'll call this, I will choose class library from my templates. And I'll say mod4 underscore business layer underscore core. So another project has now been added to my solution. So the 15SS CP mod4 is my Windows application, and I now have another project called mod4 business layer underscore core. This project will compile into a DLL. It comes defaulted with a class 1. I'm going to get rid of that because that's how I roll. So I'm going to right click on that project. I'm going to say add class. I'm going to create a user class. I will make this class public. And the reason I'm making it public is because if it's not public, then the class cannot be seen outside the scope or context of this class library project. And my goal is that the web form or the WinForm application will be able to see this class and use it. Right? That's the goal. So I'll make it public. I'll add my properties. Last name, string email, string password. Okay, so now I have my user class. And I need to go through and actually kind of get those pieces working together. Now that I have this class, I want to be able to take, and when I add a user, I want to add that user and I want to actually save it somewhere. I want to be able to persist it. I want to store it in a database of some sort. Now to do that, actually let me stop here.